Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 48 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the New York Islanders and lost by a score of 4-1. And so yet again, it is another game in which the Sharks managed to just put up a single goal on the board. In fact, if you take a look at their last 10, including the one here tonight, the Sharks have scored at most one goal in 7 of those 10 games, putting their goals for per game over that stretch of time at just 1.7. And this is including that 6-3 win a few days ago against the Detroit Red Wings. If you were to remove that, it becomes even worse. But at 1.7, that is still not nearly good enough to win games on a consistent basis. And so it was a few reviews ago where I talked about how I much rather to see the Sharks lose games like 5-4 or these high scoring affairs compared to ones like tonight where they lose 4-1 or 3-1 or 4-0 or whatever the case may be, because at least that brings some level of excitement. But right now, there's not a ton of excitement with the way that the Sharks have been playing. At the very least, as of late, when they've had these uninspired performances over these last few weeks, they usually are able to come out with a relatively decent response game. So a few weeks ago, when the Sharks got shut out at home on New Year's Eve by the Philadelphia Flyers 4-0, they came out the next game with a very respectable effort against a good Tampa Bay Lightning team and picked up a 2-1 victory. Then, a week or so ago against the Utah Hockey Club, the Sharks again an uninspired performance where they lose 2-1, but the very next day they come out with a game in which they still lose 3-1 to Minnesota, but at least had kind of the control of that one. They controlled the pace of that game. But after the one last night, or a couple of nights ago against the Columbus Blue Jackets that they end up losing 4-1, you're hopeful that the similar type of bounce back could happen here tonight against the New York Islanders, but we got nothing of the sort. Now, it should be noted, we did get a little bit of sort of background info, something that we very rarely get from the San Jose Sharks, but we did hear tonight, which is that the Sharks are dealing with some sort of bug going through the dressing room. It kept out Timothy Liljegren from tonight's game. It seems to also be preventing Yaroslav Askarov from getting these starts, which is an explanation for why Georgiev has been playing a lot as of late. And of course, we have no other possible way of knowing which of these other Sharks players are actually being affected by this. And I also mentioned that at this point of the season, the Sharks need to be able to bring their A game if they actually want to be competitive with a lot of these teams that have some very real motivations left for the season. And so if some of these Sharks players, because of this flu or whatever the case may be, are playing instead at like 60 or 70% of their usual level, well, suddenly it becomes a lot more difficult to win. However, since I have no way of actually knowing which of these players are affected and how much that they are, I can only really discuss what I am seeing on the ice. And what I saw on the ice from the Sharks here tonight was quite bad. After that third period the other night against Columbus, where they brought things back a little bit, you're hoping that momentum will carry into the first period here tonight, and it did absolutely nothing of the sort. This first period was terrible for the Sharks. Sure, they don't give up a goal against, which is not something that can be said about the second or the third here tonight, but they themselves generate absolutely nothing. And as I mentioned, the prime issue for the Sharks as of late has been their offense. It's one thing if their defense is struggling, but again, at least you can lose a game 5-4, but when you're only scoring one, it's just absolutely awful to watch. And so in this first period, the Sharks getting 0 chances on net, it's not a great look. They were quite lucky, in fact, to escape with a game tied at 0. But in the second period, the karma came back and caught up to them because they give up 3 here to Barzal, to Nelson, and to Dobson. While they do manage to score 1 from Barclay Goodrow, it's not even the type of goal that you're actually all that excited about. No offense to Barclay Goodrow, but this isn't a consistent goal scorer's goal. If you look at least at the one goal that they scored against Columbus 2 nights ago, this was a nice one, a good pass from Celebrini, great work in front by Tyler Toffoli. This Goodrow goal is one that should realistically never have gone in. This is an extremely easy save for the Islanders goaltender, and yet it does somehow manage to fool him. This should have otherwise been a shutout night for New York, and yet the Sharks managed to avoid that because of this lucky one for Goodrow. And so this isn't even a type of moment to hang your hat on. It is again just an indication of how much of a struggle it has been to come by these goals or at least recently, for the Sharks. Then in the third period, You're maybe hoping that they can respond as they did with the help of score effects at the end of that Columbus game, but nothing of the sort. It is the Islanders who strike just about a minute into this third period, and that seems to just put the game away. Not much else doing, and it is a 4-1 win for the Islanders. The Sharks lose yet again. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Eklund and Celebrini joined by Ty Dellandrea. Now, this is not a willing decision made by Ryan Warsofsky. He's not that crazy, but instead it is Tyler Toffoli who ends up being an extremely late scratch to this game. I believe he participated in the warm-ups, but then ends up getting pulled out of the lineup at the very last second, and so it does leave the Sharks scrambling for someone to fill into this role. There's no way with them being on the road with how last second this was that they could call somebody up, and so you kind of have to find an answer within, and I was extremely nervous that it would end up being someone like Barclay Goodrow getting the promotion to this top line, and I'm happy that that did not end up happening, but it turns out the answer that Warsofsky ends up with is really not that much better, and that is Ty Dellandrea, who provided very little to this top line at all. In fact, was almost a detriment to it, because it's one thing if you're just not really able to continue much of the play, but it's an entirely different thing when you are yourself giving pucks away and also taking penalties. That is really just being a detriment to this top line. And the thing is that Eklund and Celebrini are incredibly important to this team, not just for the future, looking 3 years into the future for San Jose, but just currently right now. Over these last few games, this top line, including Toffoli usually, has been basically the only good line for the Sharks. Even going back to that 6-3 win against the Detroit Red Wings, a combination of Celebrini, Eklund, and Toffoli factored into pretty much every single one of those goals, not counting the empty netter of course. Only the first goal of that Detroit game did not involve one of these three players. And so especially with Toffoli out, Eklund and Celebrini, and with some of the other guys slumping, this is a line that you need to have perform. And so I would have tried someone like Smith in this role. I would have tried Zetterlund in this role. I would have even been willing to go with Luke Cunnin in this role. To have Dellandrea play here, it just didn't really work out. And what surprised me even more is that we have seen Ryan Warsofsky be very willing to throw the lines in the blender this season to work around the line combinations. And this isn't even the case in which you're trying to create some level of chemistry between these three players. Dellandrea should hopefully never find himself playing on this top line with Eklund and Celebrini ever again, and so this isn't really something that you're trying to hammer home. If you're just looking to spark some level of offense in this game, why does Dellandrea from start to finish remain with these two players? We had players like, Graf was always an option here. Smith actually was playing relatively well. Get him up there. Maybe you could put Zetterlund, even have Granlund take a shift or two with these top two players, but somehow, some way, Dellandrea keeps this spot the entire time, and it is no surprise that he provides nothing to this group of players. And so it was essentially just Eklund and Celebrini against the world. There was actually a pretty good shift for these two players that we saw in this game, in which they were on the ice with Dellandrea, of course, and then I believe it was Ferraro and Ceci up at the blue line. You're basically outmatched in terms of offensive talent here. You got three guys who have pretty much none of it, and it is the onus so heavily onto Celebrini and Eklund that it's not a surprise that they're not able to get much of anything generated, but they still ended up being two of the more dangerous players on the ice for the Sharks when it came to actually generating zone time. They did manage to get their looks. They were a little bit out of sync, I would say. There were a few times in which Eklund was fanning on passes or Celebrini was passing it to nobody. But again, I can't really blame them with just how much of the load of the offense was on their shoulders here tonight. They did not get a ton of help. And so while both of them, I think that there were, some things that they could work on defensively and maybe not the best game offensively, it's hard to really fault them too much. You almost, in a way, feel bad with how little help they did get tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Smith, Granlund, and Zetterlund. So nice to see Will Smith get the promotion up to this position here after spending the last couple of games on the third, since he was one of the Sharks' better forwards the other night against Columbus. He ends up in this spot. And again, although it's once more not saying much with how poorly some of these Sharks forwards did, Smith, I felt as though, was one of the better ones. He was involved. He was setting up chances. At this point, even if you're looking at him and saying, well, the defense was not very good, as I mentioned earlier on, the first priority for the San Jose Sharks should be trying to solve some offensive problems. If you want this team to actually have some excitement and some motivation and some will and some energy to actually go at it, it's not enough to be trying to play these games 2-1. You actually have to get some goals scored, and that's what Smith was at the very least attempting to do here tonight. He had a few good looks, he had a few good setups as well, and so I actually thought Smith was rather solid. When it comes to his two line mates, however, the same can't really be said. Now, this is a combination of the fact that the bar is maybe slightly higher for a player like Mikael Granlund than it is for a player like Will Smith, but still the effort is just not quite there for Granlund, and this has really been the case, as I've talked about many times, for a good couple of months at this point. Granlund is just not involved enough in these games at this point. The offensive level is just not quite there. There were a couple of plays in which Will Smith set him up very well, and yet this puck was just bobbling over his stick, and that's something that I would expect from a Will Smith, but I wouldn't expect from someone who is supposed to have the poise and the finesse to actually be able to finish on these chances. Granlund probably could have had a point or two if he was a little bit more locked in, so to speak, and I will say Granlund did improve slightly as this game wore on. I do think his third period was probably the best of the game for him, but that's really not saying much, and it just remains once again the general message, as I have been giving for pretty much the last better part of a couple of months, is that Granlund simply needs to be better. This is the type of performance that is not good enough, and if he was not a rookie, a veteran type of player who Warsofsky respects indefinitely, he would be the type of guy falling down the lineup a little bit, because again, you're just not getting enough of contributions from him. And then when it comes to his final line partner, Fabian Zetterlund, very similar things to be said about Zetterlund. I don't think he was particularly locked in here tonight. I don't think he was particularly involved. There were some weak back checks in this game. There were some decent ones, but some pretty weak back checks as well, especially on, I think it was the Brock Nelson goal that the Islanders would end up scoring, and you're just not getting nearly as much offense as you would hope from Zetterlund. This is why actually I thought as this game was going on that one would have swapped Dellandrea off that top line, play Zetterlund with Eklund and Celebrini. Zetterlund is used to playing with Eklund, and that could have potentially sparked something. It is very surprising to me that Warsofsky wouldn't have tried to juggle the lines literally at all in this game, because it was one of their worst offensive efforts that we have seen in a while, and that is also pretty crazy to say because they have not been very good offensively as of late. Then when it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Wennberg, Grundstrom, and Cunnin. Now, this is kind of like a good news and bad news type of situation with this line. The bad news is that over the course of the 60 minutes, they really didn't do a ton consistently, but at the very least, the good news is that when they did get an offensive zone shift, which was very few and far between, but it happened 2 or 3 times here, they actually did an alright job. The fact is that with Grundstrom on this third line, it has a pretty clear identity at this point, which is just crash the net and hope you're going to get the lucky bounce, which is perfectly fine. That is something that the Sharks have not done nearly enough of this season. And so to see Grundstrom and Cunnin really go at it in the crease and actually come relatively close to scoring a couple of times in this game, I'm appreciative of that, even if their general games tonight weren't actually all that good. When it comes to Alex Wennberg, I didn't even really notice him for the first 30 minutes tonight, but then he did have 2 really strong shifts, or decently strong shifts at the end of the second period, which were pretty good, and then a couple of also decent looks in the third, so I can't be too upset with what Wennberg was doing. When it comes to Carl Grundstrom, he continues to be someone who is involved physically for the Sharks. He's willing to lay the body, which is something that's important to do against a bigger Islanders team that is willing to also lay the body back onto you. So I thought Grundstrom had a decent night here tonight. And when it comes to Luke Cunnin, yeah, you're a little bit disappointed to have seen the scoring dry up as much as it did compared to earlier on, where he was actually managing to contribute with some goals here or there, but it's nowhere near the type of disappointment as you feel for a player like Granlund or Zetterlund, where the bar offensively is significantly higher. Cunnin, you know what you're going to get out of him, which is just that bottom 6 player, and so even if the goal scoring has obviously gone away at this point, you're still not too upset with what you saw here tonight. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, obviously Barclay Goodrow, he does manage to score the goal. I kind of, downplayed it a little bit earlier on where I said that this was a very lucky goal, which it absolutely was. But looking past that, I thought Goodrow generally had an all right enough game. He wasn't like a huge detriment. There was one really bad giveaway in this one where he kind of just loses body position and has the puck easily stripped away from him, like a Will Smith type of moment by Casey Cizikas, I believe, which led to more offensive zone time for the Islanders. But generally, I don't think he was too terrible. And then when it comes to his two line mates, we have Nico Sturm, who I actually thought started this game off very well. He had a lot of energy in the first few minutes of this first period, but then kind of faded into the background a little bit and then didn't really finish the game off all that strong. And then we have Colin Graf, and Graf is a very interesting inclusion into the lineup because he was not expected to play. It was expected that Grundstrom would take his spot and he would be that 13th forward on the outside looking in, but he ends up drawing into the lineup here because of that late scratch to Tyler Toffoli, and Warsofsky simply had no other options to go to because he's the only other forward who is currently available and not injured at this point. And so it was sort of a weird night, and I wonder if that type of last second inclusion sort of threw him off a little bit. These players have these pre-game rituals, and perhaps Graf didn't go through with it because he didn't think that he would be playing. So that could be one possible explanation for why he didn't end up having a particularly good game here tonight. This also connects back to sort of a reason for why Graf actually ends up being on this fourth line here. Why is it that Warsofsky decided to scratch him for this game? Probably just the general case of he is a player who didn't really look all that good in the previous one, and because he is a young player, we know that the coaches will immediately be harsher on that young guy instead of the more veteran players. Did Luke Cunnin have a particularly good game against Columbus? No, but he's clearly not going to be the one stepping out of the lineup, and you can agree or disagree with that how you weigh. Obviously, I'm more so in the disagree camp, but it's the way that these coaches are going to deal with things. Graf, I thought maybe he could have gotten that promotion to the top line with Eklund and Celebrini, but it was clear that Warsofsky was trying to send some level of message to him for tonight's game, and so he ends up sticking with the fourth line and not looking particularly good. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, in my previous review against Columbus, I talked about how the Sharks defensively I didn't think were nearly as bad as it may have appeared on paper. Here tonight, however, I do think it was as bad as it would appear. The Sharks defense just did not look very good at all, and against an Islanders team who honestly is not really known to be bringing all that high level of an offense. This isn't the best team in the NHL. In fact, they are one of the worst teams in terms of the standings in the NHL. They made the Islanders look like a solid playoff team with how many mistakes that they were making in their own zone. And this starts off with the top defensive pairing featuring Wallman and Ceci. Wallman was quite good against Columbus, but he was quite bad here tonight, not only from an offensive perspective where he provided very, very little, but also from a defensive perspective, caught flat-footed multiple times in the zone, really bad giveaways as well. Definitely one of his worst games of the season, and that is kind of like a domino effect to the rest of the Sharks D-men, because as I mentioned, Wallman is the best on the team, and when he's not playing well, it likely means the rest of them aren't playing well either, and that goes for his defensive partner Cody Ceci, who was not as bad as Wallman, but didn't have too many redeeming qualities either. Not a great outing for him. Then we get to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, where we do have Thrun playing with Mario Ferraro. As I mentioned earlier on, Liljegren out with the flu, which is not even necessarily the worst thing in the world for the Sharks, because Liljegren did not play very well against Columbus, so he may have been a healthy scratch anyway, but Thrun, perhaps going back to what I mentioned about Colin Graf, if Thrun didn't think he would be in the lineup here tonight, maybe he didn't do his pre-game rituals or whatever, that maybe affected his game, because this was also one of his worst games of the season. It felt as though he was just completely lost in the defensive zone at times here tonight, really just not making the correct play multiple different moments against the Islanders, so a rough outing for him. And then when it comes to Mario Ferraro, I will say Ferraro actually did have some effective shifts here tonight. There was one, I think it was halfway through the third, halfway through the second, can't remember exactly, where he makes multiple good offensive plays in the offensive zone with Celebrini and Eklund. In fact, on that singular shift, he provided more offense to the Sharks than Ty Dellandrea did this entire game while playing on the Sharks' top line. And that's not even an exaggeration. Ferraro actually looked decent in those couple of shifts that he did have. Obviously, outside of that, he wasn't the greatest, but in the end, because of how bad everybody else was, you could argue that Ferraro was the Sharks' best defenseman, though that's not saying much. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Vlasic and Ruda. Ruda's highlight here tonight, and I use highlight in a way that's kind of like sarcastic, which is when the Sharks had this 4-on-2 situation with, again, Eklund and Celebrini. Ruda has this puck along the wall in the offensive zone. He has a very simple, seemingly simple pass. It's like not 50 feet or anything. It's like a 10-foot pass to Willie Meckland, and it somehow is so far behind him that the Islanders pick it up and go the other way for a 3-on-1. That was just like a perfect kind of indication of the level of offense that the Sharks have gotten from Jan Rutta this season. Like, he just doesn't really provide much in that particular area, and while defensively I don't think he was terrible, it still ends up being a pretty bad game. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Marc-Edouard Vlasic, sad to see yet again it is another loss with Vlasic in the lineup. It feels so long ago when the Sharks were 3-0 while he was playing. I don't think Vlasic was terrible here tonight. I don't think he really provided much. It's kind of just going to be the general case with Vlasic, because he's not like a hugely impactful defenseman for San Jose. You're going to expect, like, if the Sharks are playing poorly, Vlasic is probably amongst that, and when the Sharks are playing well, hopefully Vlasic can be amongst that as well. So not the greatest night for him. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, Alexander Georgiev, I mentioned earlier on, Askarov under the weather, which is why Georgiev is getting yet another start here. This is a situation where there was one of these goals. This Pulock goal at the beginning of the third period was one that Georgiev definitely should have had, and is one he would want back. But he is very, very far from the first player to blame here on the San Jose Sharks. He actually gave them a very real chance of winning when he kept them in that first period 0-0. The Sharks got basically 0 chances in that first, and Georgiev is the only reason there remained a tie game. And so, yes, that third period goal wasn't the greatest, but the 3 he let in the second period, he doesn't have much of a chance on. Barzal and Nelson are essentially breakaway opportunities, and then the Dobson one goes off of Thrun in front, so a tough deflection to handle as well. Even though this is an appearance for Georgiev, you're not blaming him for this one. The Sharks doing very little favors for him in front. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday for a very early afternoon game against the Boston Bruins. The Bruins themselves have also been struggling a lot as of late, but you expect a desperate team there. They're trying to hold on to a playoff spot. For all I know, perhaps at the end of this day, they've already lost that playoff spot, but they are within the conversation at the very least. And so it's not getting any easier, the opponents that the Sharks are facing here. They'll actually need a strong effort if they want a chance to win. Class dismissed.